Welcome to the Facts versus Feelings podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dietrich, and I'm joined by my co-host, Sonu Varghese. Each week, we dive into the important market-moving events and cut through the noise to help you, as an investor, identify what really matters. Let's get this show started. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 8th edition of Carson's Facts versus Feelings with Ryan and Sonu. It is election season. It is here. We've talked about election season a lot, and we brought in who, honest to goodness, I think is one of the very best strategists and political people out there, Libby Cantrill from PIMCO. Libby, thank you so much for joining us on our new podcast. We've had a lot of traction. I think Sonu is you're our second guest. You're our second guest. Just so honored to have you. How you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. This is very exciting.
No, this is fun, and there's a lot. I mean, so much we want to talk about here the next 30 minutes. I mean, Sonu, jump in and say hi.
Hey, everyone. No, it's fantastic to have you here, Libby. You've been, so widely followed and read, and so it's an honor to have you on as a guest.
Very excited to be here.
Yeah, I mean, Sonu and I have talked politics and policy and elections, midterm elections a lot the last couple of weeks. We figured we'd have
Markets.
somebody. Well, we can do the markets thing, but we've done the other things, and now we're bringing in the big guns and the expert. I mean, yes. Libby, let's start with something real simple, and we'll get into it. Kind of, what is your role with PIMCO? How do you help investors and people listening on this podcast kind of put all the pieces together? What do you do there?
Yeah, well, that is a great question, especially given that that politics in particular tends to be quite a sensitive and very personal subject. But we really try to kind of come to politics and policy with the same sort of neutrality and objectivity as we do really any sector of the economy. So that's really my role, is to kind of evaluate what is likely to happen, whether it's as it relates to an upcoming election or legislation on Capitol Hill or from a regulatory perspective. And again, really trying to kind of bank our own biases, our own kind of political views, and really focus on what is likely to happen. I sort of liken myself to an umpire calling balls and strikes, not sort of saying where the ball should have gone, but what actually happened to the ball, to use a tortured metaphor. And I've been doing this now for about 12 years. I think I have the best job, honestly, at PIMCO and maybe anywhere. It's really unique to be able to combine a sort of a personal passion. I've always really been interested in the intersection of policy, politics, and markets and the economy, and to be able to kind of come to work every day and talk to great folks like you.
Yeah, so I guess it's safe to say your off season is in a couple weeks. Clearly, you're really busy now. Do you have to take a break in a couple weeks? How's that work?
Yeah, it's all very cyclical. It's kind of the off season. Then it will really be talking about the implications of the midterms, what actually happened, and talking about policy implications. It'll go quiet for a couple of months, but then it will rev up because remember, and I know we're going to talk about this, that the 2024 presidential elections are right around the corner. And if you can believe it, if the 2020 cycle is any indication, we're going to start hearing about debates in the summer of 2023. So that's really right around the corner. So yeah, a couple months reprieve, hopefully, in the beginning of 2023, and then a pretty quick pivot to the presidential cycle.
So we've got a lot of questions.
I was going to say,
go ahead, Sonu. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, doesn't the presidential election season start on the day after the midterms?
Well, yeah, we'll talk about that. I do think there's going to be a real read-through in many ways. And I think, yes, people are just actually stealing themselves. It's funny, Sonu, when I often have to do TV and what have you as part of my job. And after the 2020 presidential election, and right after President Biden was inaugurated that spring of 2021, I was asked about the next election, and I assumed that they were talking about the midterms. And the TV anchor said, "No, I'm talking about 2024." So I do think people are already very focused on the presidential election, which just is even the thought of it is exhausting.
Great points there. So, we've got questions. One thing I just kind of sparked me. You've been doing it for 12 years. How is it different? I mean, it does, maybe you answered it. It feels like it's 24/7. We talk about policy and politics. I've been in this industry for over 20 years. I don't remember talking about the Fed and the election that much when I first started. Is it 24/7 now from when you started 12 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. Honestly, I do think that the financial crisis was a real inflection point, and that was when PIMCO had decided to sort of create my role. And in addition to helping the investment committee think through political and policy risk, I also lead policymaker engagement. And I think for any firm that's intersecting with the markets or the economy, interacting with Washington in some form or fashion, whether it's direct lobbying or just education or engagement through trade associations, I do think has become much more of a focus really since the financial crisis. And that's why do I use that as sort of the inflection point? Well, that's of course when the government in many different ways, whether it was the central bank, whether it was fiscal policy, just right through the sort of regulatory channels, just became much more involved in the market. So I view that as kind of the inflection point. That's again sort of right when I basically right after that started this job. But I think from kind of to just answer your specific question about the 24/7 nature of this, I mean, it really has. And of course, social media has very much exacerbated that. My husband can tell you that I am like constantly scrolling Twitter. It's like the last thing I look at when I go to bed. It's like the first thing I look at in the morning. It's actually a really good source of news for me, but it also just sort of is emblematic of the fact that it truly is a 24-hour news cycle, for better or for worse. I think that,
Yep.
And we can talk about this. I think the worst thing is that because of just the heightened focus, it has turned up the temperature on the polarization in Washington. A lot of folks sort of posture for the camera, posture for Twitter, but behind the scenes, they're, I think, a lot more, reasonable and a lot more willing to compromise than you might think if you're just, reading or watching the television.
Yeah. So Sonu, I'll let you ask the first question in a second. I just want to say one more time, this is your very busy season, Libby. We're aware of that right ahead of midterms. PIMCO and Carson have been great partners for a long time, and we are just honored and delighted to have you. So we're going to put you on the hot seat now. The easy questions are done. Sonu, why don't you kick it off with the first question?
Yeah, let's come to midterms, right? And I do want to get to the fiscal policy aspect. Ryan and we talked, I mean, this is our 8th episode. It feels like we spent 7 episodes talking about the Fed and monetary policy. So it's kind of a nice switch, especially at this time. But just to level set here, right? So midterm elections usually see the president's party lose, assuming they have a majority in Congress and the Senate and the House of Representatives, and which Democrats have right now. And going back to the beginning of the year, I imagine if you told anyone, at least anyone who sort of follows politics, and like, okay, you've got inflation at 40-year highs. You've got gas prices well above what it was last year. The president's approval rating is going to be, close to 40% or just above that. I would think Democrats would lose about, 50, 60 seats and lose the Senate as well. So that's just like a base case, right? But where are we at now relative to that?
Yeah, so I think that is broadly correct. If we were doing this podcast, say in May or June of this year, we really were anticipating a pretty significant red wave, Republicans taking back, flipping the House, and very likely flipping the Senate because of all the things that you just pointed out. I mean, there is sort of this axiom in politics: gas and groceries. It is incredibly visible. It is incredibly pertinent for voters. It was very much back in May and June. It still is. This is still very much weighing on sort of confidence. If you look at the direction of the country, people are pretty peeved about, to use a word that my 8-year-old uses, just about the direction of the country. So again, if we had been in this podcast in sort of June, I would have absolutely been in agreement that it would likely be a red wave. Now, I think one just sort of nuance about what you said is that it was never going to be a loss of 50 or 60 seats in the House. And the reason is because while Democrats do have a majority now, they have a very narrow majority. They have only a 5-seat majority in the House, 50-50 Senate, only one seat majority in the Senate. So the initial conditions here matter. So really, I think that if we were seeing a red wave, we would see kind of a 30-seat loss, not a 50 or 60-seat loss. And that's only because there are just not that many toss-up seats in the House right now, given the fact that Democrats have that very narrow majority. But your broader point is well taken, is that, again, if we were talking in sort of May or June, this would have been really kind of an easy election to call. It would be very likely a red wave. But of course, things have changed since then.
Libby, one thing came up. You mentioned 5-seat majority. I believe I've read and heard that's like the smallest majority for a new party that took over the presidency in like 140 years. President Cleveland, or maybe it was President Garfield. I'm not sure. I know though. When's the last time it was that small of a majority?
Yeah, and for just to be specific about it, as a first-term Democratic president,
okay.
Yes, the narrowest majority, and that's right, of any first-term Democratic president that's to sort of navigate since Grover Cleveland, so since 1884. Wow. I probably am going to be your only guest who will mention the ghost of Grover Cleveland, but it was a very, and I think this is something interesting, Ryan, because I think people sort of forget, obviously while, and I know some folks still debate it, but while President Biden, for all intents and purposes, won the election by about 4 points or so, that the Democrats did pretty poorly in down ballot races. Yes, they were able to get a Senate victory, but of course by the smallest margins. But they did actually lose House seats. They were able to keep the majority in 2020, but they actually lost those House seats in 2020. So so the initial conditions matter, a very narrow majority, which is also, we can speak to the legislative agenda that Biden has actually been able to get through kind of amazingly enough, given those very narrow majorities in both chambers.
Great points there. So do you think maybe we don't have a red wave, but do you think Republicans will take, I think it's safe to say, I believe that if you look at the polls, they'll probably take the House by a little bit, but the Senate seems like more of a 50-50. Can you talk to us about the Senate races there?
Yeah, so I do think, just kind of to filter out the signal from the noise here a little bit, that investors should be focused on the House, because if the House flips, that's really, and we can talk about sort of policy implications, but that's the most important swing factor. If Republicans get the House and the Senate, that's kind of the cherry on top of the cake, but it is not really the cake. Really, the main focus should be whether the House flips or not. And again, I can sort of expand on that. But I think you are right that the conventional wisdom is likely right, that Republicans take back the House. Now, if we had talked 3 weeks ago, it was looking a little bit better for Democrats. We didn't be able to mitigate some of the losses. Right now, it looks like Democrats are on track of losing anywhere between kind of 10 and 30 seats. I would probably put it kind of somewhere in the middle, maybe 15 to 20. And again, that is sufficient enough for Republicans to take back the majority and have like a relatively okay cushion. It's not huge by historical standards, but it does give, say, presumed Speaker McCarthy, who will likely be the Speaker under Republicans, enough kind of wiggle room. The Senate, though, as you point out, is very much in kind of toss-up territory. Now, things are changing. I think just for folks who are listening, things to look at, the generic ballot, that's usually a good indication of how parties usually do in midterm elections. This is sort of the generic poll that asks folks if they prefer one party over the other. That had been really in Republican territory for much of this year. Then it kind of had gone over to Democratic territory briefly. It's kind of back in Republican territory. So if that continues, if that trend over the next 2 weeks or so continues, then Republicans in some of these very, very tight races in the Senate could squeak out a victory. For folks who are, again, listening, I would just say that really important Senate races and likely the control of the Senate will come down just to a handful of states. I'd be very focused on, now it looks like actually Arizona, that's become more competitive now, as Blake Masters has done a bit better against Kelly most recently. But really, I think the more competitive ones are Nevada, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Those three are likely will dictate control of the Senate. But I think the bottom line here is, again, folks should focus on the House, because that's kind of the most important swing factor. And then even if Republicans take back the Senate, it will probably be by 1 seat, maybe 2. but nowhere close to either a filibuster-proof or veto-proof majority, which is what you really need in the Senate in order to kind of affect policy change.
I'll just jump in. Sonu, I'll let you ask the next question. 1 second, Sonu. You can ask the next question in a second. It's funny, you mentioned cake. I think this is like the third or fourth podcast in a row we've actually talked about cake on this podcast. So thank you for pointing that out. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about Herschel Walker and Dr. Oz. I mean, Sonu, you can have the next question, but they seem like they're in the media. It's what people are talking about. It seems like Dr. Oz is, after that, the debate they had, he did better than expected. And even Herschel Walker. I mean, what about those two? Because they're all over the place. What do you see on those two?
Yeah, so, Pennsylvania, that's been in sort of Democratic territory. If you look at the polls, right? And we all have to take a huge grain of salt when we're looking at this polling. I think my rule of thumb is if it's within kind of a 5-point swing, it's within the margin of error, kind of regardless of what they say the margin of error is on the polling. If you're sort of outside of that 5 points, it's probably more comfortable one way or the other. But all of these races are within 5 points. With that said, Fetterman had been leading. There actually hadn't been any poll where Dr. Oz has led. Even Republican pollsters that have been doing polls in Pennsylvania have found that Dr. Oz has been lagging Fetterman. I do think Tuesday's debate, though, was like an inflection point. And honestly, I was listening to it. I was on the road visiting some other clients and listening to it at the airport, and you just think, wow, I cannot believe the Fetterman campaign agreed to this. He is clearly, and of course we all have empathy for him. We all know people who suffered a stroke, but wow, he's very impaired, and he did not do anything to assuage voters' concerns about the condition of his health. If anything, he just exacerbated those concerns. So I do think that race is very much in play. I think you could also see, interestingly, and not to get kind of too into the weeds here, but there's a really important governor's race in that state as well. I actually think you could see some split ticket voting, that folks actually vote for the Democrat for the governor, but then vote for Dr. Oz for the Senate. So it remains to be seen how that debate will play out. We haven't seen any of the polling after that, but I think that the conventional wisdom was that was a big kind of mistake, honestly, for the Fetterman campaign, and for sure did not help him, probably just hurt him. So I would say that's a very squarely in toss-up territory. Georgia also in toss-up territory. One important nuance, though, just to remember about Georgia, and we're just kind of reliving 2020 in some ways, is that if no candidate gets 50%, it forces a runoff. There's been nobody. Wow. We're not polling very briefly in late August around over 50%. I don't think either candidate will get 50%. That means that we will force to a runoff. I do think Georgia could be, again, the swing vote for the Senate, in which case we wouldn't know the direction of the Senate until December 6th. That's when the runoff is going to be. But again, I think that's just, that's more noise than it is signal, just because it really doesn't matter as much if Republicans control both the House and the Senate. What's really important is if they control the House, and we will likely know that within, maybe not on election night, but, most likely kind of the days after the election, we will have a good understanding of what, their majority looks like, if they take back the House.
So don't book your off-season trip quite yet for the Cantrill family. You're saying we could have to wait. But Sonu, I know we got more questions. Yeah, we got more questions, Sonu. Exactly. Sonu, what else do we want to ask her here?
I wanted to get to the policy agenda or lack thereof, however you want to define that. But real quick, since I have you, I know you follow, you're in the politics scene so much. What's your take on polls and what they tell us? Because, maybe there's some anchoring here because of what happened in 2016, 2020, where Democrats are, I think, safe to say, overwhelmingly favored. But we saw, Republicans doing better than expected. So I wanted to take your polls, or your take on what the polls, generally how you look at polls, and are polls overstating Democrats' chances, as much as they are.
Yeah, I mean,
polls favored them, as I said, in 2016, 2020.
Yeah, it's absolutely possible. Now, I do think, and we do not do polling here at PIMCO. We are not running our own polls, thank goodness, because I do think, to pollsters' credit, their job is incredibly difficult, right? When you were polling 30 years ago, most people had a landline. A lot of people watched the nightly news at 6 p.m. They were having dinner together. So you knew that if you were calling then, you could get more of a representative sample. And, sadly, I think folks just had more confidence in institutions, including pollsters back then. Now you fast forward to today, people are on cell phones. They're not necessarily at home watching the nightly news, eating dinner together. And they do have a lot of sort of skepticism around both institutions and including kind of pollsters. So there is this, and what we saw in 2016 and 2020 when President Trump was on the ballot is lots of folks who did not respond. And as a result, they were underrepresented in this polling. Now, of course, as not to get too much into the guts of this, pollsters, they try to take as random of a sample as possible, and then they kind of rebalance that sample versus what they think the likely voter base is going to be. So what they missed on both 2016 and 2020 is who actually turned out to vote. It was a lot of those Trump voters who came out to vote, and they were undersampled in their kind of overall, the weighting. Now, pollsters have tried to fix that again. They're trying to take education background into and geography into more consideration. But again, this is definitely like art versus more art than science, even though I think some folks think will claim it as science. So long way of saying we have sympathy for pollsters. They have a difficult job. With that said, you definitely have to take it with a grain of salt. Democrats have been sort of oversampled in a lot of these polls, especially in 2016 and 2020. They did get 2018 correct, though. If you look at the state polls in 2018, they were much more accurate. Now, was that because Trump wasn't on the ballot? Like, who knows? So we'll sort of see in 2020. I do think this is another test, though, for pollsters. If they fail this test, I think we're going to see fewer polls, unfortunately, just because folks are going to kind of take themselves out of the game, so to speak.
I can't imagine that'll be helpful to have fewer polls.
No, exactly.
And just going to the policy agenda, right? If as you said, if Republicans win the House, which looks like they will, the Biden agenda, for as much as there is left anymore on the table, it's practically it's dead, right? But so are we looking at mostly like a debt ceiling fight? And are we looking at, if the Biden administration wants the debt ceiling increased, are Republicans going to ask them for Social Security, Medicare cuts? And is that where we're going to end up?
Yeah, so I think kind of zooming out, if we're looking at, this is why I think, again, the focus is on the House, not necessarily the House and the Senate, because as long as Republicans control the House, they will be able to use their most important lever, which is to obstruct. That they can do that if they just control the House. They can obviously do that if they control both the House and the Senate. So to your point, there will be a complete freeze of the Biden legislative agenda. Now, from the market's perspective, that will be welcome, particularly as it relates to possible tax increases. So there will be no more kind of policy tax headline risk, if you will, whether it is increasing individual taxes or windfall taxes or what have you, whatever kind of the headline of the day is. So that will come to a screeching halt. Importantly, though, and I just want to make sure folks remember this, is that the individual tax cuts under the TCJA, the Trump Tax Cut Jobs Act, will all expire at the end of 2025. So that is the next big inflection point should Republicans take back one or two chambers, no changes to tax policy. You then look to the end of 2025. That's the next sort of big inflection point. So that's one area. So kind of obstruction, freezing of the agenda, including tax changes. The other kind of big lever that Republicans will be able to exercise is their oversight lever. When you control either House and Senate, you're able to not only control floor time, you're also able to control the committees, which means that you're able to control which topics you investigate. I think there will be a ton of investigations. Republicans will couch this as oversight. Democrats will say this is a witch hunt, what have you. Welcome to the partisanship of Washington, D.C., but on things from regulation, student loans, China, what have you. And then kind of thirdly, as you point out, there will be more policy volatility around things that, I think as Americans, not making a political statement, we wish that there were kind of more support for in funding the government. That is a basic obligation of a member of Congress. We might, you might kind of quibble around levels and what have you, but to kind of take that hostage has become a tactic on both the right and the left, as well as the debt ceiling. Now, the debt ceiling looks like it won't have to be increased until kind of the third or fourth quarter. It depends on how the student loan calculation factors in and some other some other sort of variables, but we're not really talking about that fight until the third quarter. But what Republicans have made clear is, yes, they will take this hostage. And so that means in our markets, the fixed income markets, there will likely be some volatility. Now, I think we've been able to kind of look through that. We've actually been able to take advantage of it for clients. There, some mispricing, which we, can sort of take advantage of again. But, if we're that close to the brink, and it really does feel like this time could be different, and they actually do take the United States borrowing authority over the cliff, that obviously means not only bad things for the fixed income market, but also for risk markets just broadly. So, yes, it's going to be kind of a contentious period of time with probably more policy volatility and, as a result, market volatility.
Great stuff there. I mean, this is awesome. We've got time for two more questions, but I did want to kind of just chime in and get to know you a little bit. You've got an 8-year-old. You live in New York. Okay, what do you guys like to do for fun? I mean, when you're not talking politics and you try to get out of this world that we live in, what do you guys like to do?
Yeah, well, I have actually almost 8-year-old. She'll be 8 next week.
Okay.
And then I have an 11-year-old actually as well. Okay. And yeah, we live in New York City. I grew up in Colorado though, so my husband's from Minnesota, so neither of us really anticipated either living or raising a family in New York. But it is, there's some bad. It's not exactly a clean city, but there's also some really great things about it, including, lots of public spaces, lots of museums, lots of diversity. So yeah, we just, on the weekends we enjoy the city. I'm right now, if people who have kids are empathetic to this, our kids are really involved in lots of activities. So yep. I find that we spend most of our weekends like shuttling them from one thing to another. But yeah, and we don't really talk a lot about politics, although my 11-year-old just ran for student government. Very exciting for me. And I helped him with his slogan, and so he seems more interested. He is asking me about the generic ballot every night, and then also about how I'm seeing the Georgia Senate race play out in particular, because he likes sports. So Herschel Walker has some resonance for him.
So I got to ask, if he ran, did he win?
He did win. He did win, yes.
There we go. Okay, good. I was hoping he did. Awesome.
Yes, he ran and he won, yes.
Okay,
so he's
good.
Like, he's feeling the stress of being like a public servant. He says everyone has ideas for him. He's getting very overwhelmed. He's planning his Halloween party. But yeah.
That's awesome. Well, cool. Well, congrats there.
That's great.
Yeah. Exactly. So again,
it's nice to have your mom as campaign manager, I suppose.
I know. Yeah. I'm ready for it. I'm ready for it.
That's awesome. Well, we got time for two more questions. Again, this has been awesome. We probably could talk for an hour on all this stuff. Let's say we've got divided government at the end. We've got a lot of people who listen to this podcast for investment advice. And I know you've broken down all the numbers. Let's say we kind of pretty much a divided government, kind of gridlock. Is gridlock really good for stocks? Talk to us about that, Libby.
Yeah, so gridlock has been historically good for stocks. Interestingly, this is a very interesting stat. If you go back to like the 1930s, every year post a midterm election, the market's actually done well. It had a nominal positive return. Now, of course, the market circumstances next year in terms of inflation, recession risk, war in Ukraine, China-U.S. tensions, and what have you, may make 2023 quite different and the exception to that historical norm, but it is a historical norm. Now, if you kind of unpack that and you look at actually how the market has done under either kind of a split Congress or united control of Congress, but then a president being in a different party, so sort of split government, as you said, the market's actually done even better. So, under those two kind of combinations, which are again the most likely scenario, either a Republican Congress or a split Congress with, of course, Biden in the White House, the market's done quite well. So, we can't say past is prologue. Of course, we all make the caveats that previous performance is no indicator of future performance. But if you're just looking at the historical trend, the markets have actually led to gridlock. But Ryan, if I may, I'm just gonna sort of add maybe sort of a note of caution to that. Not only did we talk about the debt ceiling, potential source of volatility, but the other thing that I think we should very much count on under most circumstances next year is that there will be very little fiscal support. So very little counter-cyclical kind of fiscal engagement should the economy slow down. And why do I say that? Well, Republicans ideologically have always been, or historically at least, have been opposed to a lot of government spending. So that's one sort of philosophy, ideology. Two, though, importantly, and this actually applies to some Democrats too, is that now interest expense is much higher. So if you actually look at the percentage that government funds and budget is going to actually interest expense, it's much higher, of course, because rates are higher. And it's actually crowding out some other priorities. So there's really going to be a lot of reticence about any sort of government spending or kind of increased government spending, even if we go into recession. So that's sort of a nuance. And again, that the market has responded well in these times after midterms, particularly under divided government. But I'd say the only caveat to that is when you don't have united government, you have a much higher chance of sort of less fiscal support, again, even in a time of a downturn. And I think that will be the case also in 2023.
Well, that's great. I mean, Sonu, you can ask the last question here in a second about 2024. I'll just point out we've looked into this too, and correct me if I'm wrong, Libby, but one of the strongest time for stocks historically was a Democratic president with both chambers of Congress red. That was President Clinton in the late 90s, right? Stocks did just fine then under that scenario, correct?
That's exactly right. Now, of course, it's a different economic environment, but we can all help. We can all help, especially after this type of year. And I will say, I mean, just plug for fixed income, right? I mean, rates now at 4%, like 4 to 5%, depending on when the Fed stops, like things are looking more attractive too. So it's not just the bond market. Actually, we get some nice carry in the fixed income market next year as well.
Great stuff. Sonu, the final
question.
Back
to the late 90s. Yeah. Yep. Late 90s, yeah, we were still at around 4% interest rates, if I remember right. But no, I think that's hopefully something positive to look forward to. Ryan has written a lot about this as well, like, how the next 6 months really are, the best 6 months of a four-year presidential cycle. So just to end on something positive here, I thought I'll ask, is there some legislative area where you see both parties working together, maybe defense? Or I was just looking at, the day we are recording is when Q3 GDP numbers came out, and defense was a positive contributor after several quarters. So just looking at, what's positive, where can everyone agree on something?
Yeah, and again, I think that if you just look at our social media and if you look at redistricting and lots of other sort of things, structurally, we seem like an incredibly divided partisan country. If you go kind of behind the scenes, though, on Capitol Hill, like, yes, the temperature is certainly turned up, but there are lots of areas where members work together all day long, right? I mean, Speaker Boehner used to be one of our advisors, and he would always say, like, the newspapers only write about the things where there's a lot of conflict. They never write about the things that flood insurance, the defense authorization bill, like things that actually have lots of bipartisan support. So I will just sort of say that there is more kind of bipartisan support for things generally than may meet the eye. There are some particular policy issues that I do think we could see some traction on. One is crypto. There's a big open question about kind of the direction of crypto, which regulators have the remit over what, whether it's a security or whether it's a commodity, and as a result, how it's actually regulated. I think we could see legislation kind of regardless of what the election outcome is on that. I think we also see the Secure 2.0. That's a big sort of subsequent retirement legislation to the retirement legislation that was passed in the Trump era. There's a lot of bipartisan support for that. We could actually see that in the lame duck session, if not next Congress. And then you're right to point out defense. Defense does have a lot of support from both sides of the aisle. And I will just say on this point, and this is something we've been tracking, obviously, the war in Ukraine very closely, our emerging markets team in particular. And, I would just fade these comments from both sides, both corners of the parties that are saying that they are not going to continue to spend on Ukraine. It is just not an option, honestly. There is a lot of hawkishness on Russia in particular on both sides of the aisle. And while it may play well to the corners of their bases, it is not the kind of the broader view in Congress. There will continue to be funding. It may have a little bit more oversight attached to it if Republicans come into power, but there will continue to be funding for that war for the foreseeable future, just because I think the stakes are so high should there not continue to be support. I think people do not think that letting Putin win in any form or fashion is an option. And as a result, there will continue to be support for Ukraine.
Interesting. I guess I lied. I'm sorry. One more question. When
No worries.
we met a couple months ago, we talked with our advisors. Awesome discussion similar to this. We talked about, will President Biden run again in 2024? What are your thoughts on that?
So I have no edge on this. I have to be
Mhm.
like very upfront. There are things that I say, that
Right.
I'd like to think that I have an informed view. I do not have an informed view. I have my own personal view. My own personal
Mhm.
view on this is that I don't think he will run again.
Mhm.
Now, it could be somewhat informed by the midterm election outcome. Say, and this is very unlikely to happen, but theoretically, if Democrats really outperformed, then sure, could you see that Biden would take that as a positive reflection on his own governing style and what have you, his own record, and then declare again? Sure. That seems very unlikely. And I just think that the folks who really matter in Biden world, his sister, for instance, his wife, I just would be very surprised if they are privately not advising him just to step aside. That's how he had characterized his presidency, that it was going to be a transitional presidency. And he's going to be, and this is like not a knock on him. First of all, the presidency is a very difficult job. I feel like being the Fed chair and the president of the United States right now are like the two most difficult jobs. And he is older, of course. I mean, I'm 45, and the idea of like trying to adhere to his schedule is brutal. So I do think that will be a limiting factor. And then on the Trump, I think that's sort of the same thing for President Trump, honestly. I think that he's going to, of course, be very tempted to run, and there will be a read through to the midterms if his folks like Blake Masters or Dr. Oz or Herschel Walker all do very well and run the table, then probably the chances of him declaring are higher. But absent that, I just think that he is going to be reluctant about running again and potentially losing again. So, we'll see. Again, I have no real edge on this. These are just sort of my personal views. So as a result, I think, again, for implications for the market is it's either going to be an incumbent rematch, Biden versus Trump, kind of a repeat of 2020, or I think it's going to be a very crowded primary on both sides of the aisle, where you do have this sort of fight for the soul of each party happening in a pretty messy, in a noisy way.
Oh,
A lot of debates, but
A lot of debates.
speaking of age, I know, Ryan, you're going to close out, so just wanted to wish you a happy birthday. I know this is the day we record. Tomorrow is your birthday.
yes.
So happy birthday. Hoping for a good, positive market day. Best day for the markets in 2022, hopefully.
Yeah, I turned 44 tomorrow, so getting up there,
happy
getting up
birthday.
there. Well, thank you, and Libby, honestly, thank you so much for joining us. This was an awesome discussion. We're huge fans of you and everything you do for PIMCO, and obviously just our industry in general. Trying to connect. That's what Sonu and I try to do too. Connect the dots to make it easier for the average person to understand what's going on. And with midterms, there's a lot of confusion out there. I think you did an awesome job. And I'll be honest, about 20, 25 years, I look forward to your son, potentially, maybe not if you want him to, but potentially
Honestly,
being
I
in
mean,
politics, running for things. I mean,
Yeah,
that's like, yeah,
of course. I
exactly.
really
So,
appreciate it.
Yes.
And
no,
happy birthday, almost. And thanks so much for your partnership. We so appreciate it here at PIMCO, our partnership with Carson. So lovely. I'm very honored to be on your podcast. So wonderful. And hopefully we can do it again at some point.
Absolutely. This was the 8th Facts versus Feelings, and I promise you'll be back on again if you want to be back on. So everybody, thank you. Hopefully this was an awesome discussion. We appreciate it. Sonu and I will be back next week to talk about everything then. Everyone have a great week. Take care. Information provided on Facts versus Feelings with Sonu Varghese and Ryan Dietrich are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. The statements and opinions of show guests may not be reflective of CWM LLC or its affiliates. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss. To determine what may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial or tax advisor prior to investing. Guests on Facts versus Feelings are not affiliated with CWM LLC.